Well, if you think about God's righteousness, it doesn't come from a law. Like God doesn't become
Yeah.
righteous by following a bunch of
It's the
laws.
other way around.
Yeah, it's the other way around. And then the law, that's why the law and the prophets testify to God's righteousness. God's faithful even to the unfaithful, right?
Mhm.
And that's what Hosea was saying.
Well, that's fortunate because that's all of us.
Yeah, well, that's what this passage says, right? Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we are continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And in this episode, in the Old Testament, we're going to be focusing on the book of Hosea, and we're going to talk about the faithful love of God. And then we're going to move into the New Testament, and we're going to also talk about that same theme of God's faithfulness and mercy that we see in the New Testament. Now, Hosea is an interesting book. It's the first book of the minor prophets, which in the Hebrew Bible is also called the 12. And the minor prophets doesn't mean that they're inferior or less important than, say, any of the other prophets we've been studying. It just means that their books are shorter, which is a relief, actually. So,
Less homework.
yeah. So now, as we have in the past, sometimes we jump back in time because the biblical books are not in chronological order. And in this case, we've been talking about Jeremiah and Isaiah and Daniel, things that were happening during the captivity of Judah. And now we're jumping back to Hosea, who was prophesying in Israel, the northern tribes, before they were destroyed in 722 BC. So this actually predates some of the stuff we've been talking about, although he was kind of a contemporary of Isaiah. So, Caleb, you're our historian, and so give us some background on Hosea.
Yeah. So Hosea starts prophesying, like you said, before Isaiah, although there's some overlap. The first verse of Hosea says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel." So that's the split, the northern-southern split between Israel and Judah. And
what's interesting about this is those are the same exact kings of Judah that we talked about in Isaiah. Isaiah 1:1 has the same list.
Yeah, well, part of that is because Uzziah technically reigns for a long time, but he has leprosy, and
Yes.
Jotham takes over as regent.
Yeah.
So there's overlap there because Uzziah is just hanging around with his limbs falling off.
Yeah. And since in this case, Hosea is actually a prophet operating in the northern part of Israel, and he's prophesying to Israel, then he mentions Jeroboam II there in his list also from Israel.
Yeah.
And he reigned for a long time too.
Jeroboam from
the north,
Judah or from
the northern tribes. Yeah, from Israel.
Oh, yeah, I mixed them up there for a second. Sorry.
Yeah.
So Hosea has potentially a long ministry, although again, we don't know. This could just like barely sneak into either reign. We don't know his exact dates.
Oh, you know what might have messed you up on the Jeroboam thing is that there's two Jeroboams. Like the first one was the very first king
of both
when
kingdoms.
Rehoboam and Jeroboam kind of split the kingdom up, and then this is Jeroboam II later on. That's what. Yeah.
So anyway, like these four kings, like you said, are mentioned in Isaiah, and Jeroboam died in 753. So Hosea must have started working at some point before that, and had to finish by 722 BC.
Mm-hmm.
That would be when
Samaria was.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When Samaria is overthrown.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So at least 30 years there, probably, maybe longer. But the 700 BC is what we're looking at.
Yeah, and Isaiah. I think we said before he started prophesying around 741, and he prophesied all the way down into the 7th century. Because Judah was still around.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but Samaria and the northern kingdom falls in 722.
yeah.
And so everyone from that area would have already been ravaged and deported. And we saw where the Assyrians sent in basically colonists to repopulate the area. And that's why, and we'll see some of this in Hosea, the northern tribes kind of become lost and just disappear because they're intermingled. The whole area is populated by foreigners. All right, so like we've been talking about with all the prophets, Hosea is going to fit that mold of the covenant enforcer, calling people back to covenant with God. But the way that he does that, which doesn't appear to have been his idea, God tells him to. The way he does that is pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, God tells him, let's read in Hosea 1, verse 2. It says, "When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, 'Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord.'" So,
do I have to?
yeah. So, I mean, the problem there is, right, you're having these children, you don't even know if they're your own children.
Right, yeah.
And so, like, you're going to pay to raise somebody else's children, or, you have no idea what's going on. And,
I like what I would expect God to say there is these people have been unfaithful. He says the land is unfaithful.
yeah.
There's a tie in there. Remember, we've seen earlier, he says that the land itself needs a rest from you because you haven't been giving it the Sabbath rest. So how about I just get rid of you?
Well, and the covenant curses are tied to the land also.
Yeah.
And so,
I like that that's the choice of words there.
Yeah. Yeah. God's covenant is being described as a marriage here. And, if you think about unfaithfulness in a marriage, like we were just talking about, like you're sharing your wife with another man sexually, and you're having children, you don't know if they're yours, and you think about how disgusting that would be to a husband to consider, and then you think about, well, is the unfaithfulness to the covenant any less disgusting to God?
Right.
When
these are his chosen people, right? And they go and they marry pagan people and have children, bring them up. They don't follow the Shema, right? They bring them up under pagan cultic practices, or they don't bring them up because they sacrifice them to an idol. So, and God's in that same position. Like, what is, these might as well not even be Israelite children that you're having.
Yeah, he's wanting to get this point across to the Israelites, and so he's asking his prophet to use his own marriage as an object lesson for the whole country and about their own unfaithfulness. And so it's such a bizarre request, but let's look at, here's the story of what happens. Okay. It's Hosea 1:3 through 2, verse 1. "So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, 'Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel.' Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, 'Call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved, for I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them.' After she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, 'Call him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, my people, and your sisters, my loved one.'"
Yeah, I wanted to point out in verse 7 there, if we can go back, where he says, I will save them not by bow, sword, battle, or horses or horsemen, but I, the Lord their God. That's interesting because you look at the future expectations of the Messiah, right?
Mm-hmm.
They keep expecting this military leader who's going to overthrow,
Yeah.
whether it's Persia or Rome or whoever their captors. But that's right here. He's saying that's not the type of salvation that it's going to be.
Well, and in this current crisis, which extended to Judah, Hezekiah, prayed to God to save them,
Mm-hmm.
and they did, right? Because the Assyrians left and didn't take Judea for whatever reason.
Not yet.
Yeah.
I think God
Well,
says
the Assyrians, yeah.
Yeah,
But
Israel or Judah.
Judah.
Yeah, that's
Hezekiah.
If you read Hezekiah's
Yeah.
story,
Mhm.
because he's faithful to God. God, kind of puts it off till after he's gone.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a reference to that. He's saying, like, I'm going to save Judah. I'm going to do it myself, and they're not even going to have to do anything.
Yeah,
And it could be referencing that.
yeah, and the names of these children are just terrible.
Yeah.
Jezreel is referencing a massacre where Jehu murdered the kings
Mm-hmm.
of Judah and Israel, and not loved, not my people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
imagine going to school. What's your name? Not loved.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when he kills all the people there in Jezreel, and he also kills the king of Judah, Ahaziah, and the king of Israel, Joram. So he takes out both, and then what's really interesting is that there's this oracle of a future hope that you were quoting from.
Mm-hmm.
Was talking about Judah being saved, but at the meantime, Israel is not. But he makes this future promise about all three of the names of the children, about how they'll turn around
Yes.
in the future. And for Jezreel, the thing he says is that Judah and Israel will be reunited. And I think that's interesting because, they were both killed by Jehu.
At Jezreel.
Yeah, they were both kingdoms' kings were killed by him. And so now he's saying, well, they'll be reunited under one king, which that's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then the low Ruhamah is not loved, but now is my loved one.
Yeah.
And
in
then
chapter 2, verse 1.
Yeah, and then with not my people, he says, now you are sons of the living God. And so that's
And again in chapter 2, he says, say to my people, my loved one, and my people.
mm-hmm.
So he's contradicting those names. So
Yeah.
it's a real moment of judgment, but also with the promise of mercy.
Yeah, and that's kind of a foreshadow because then what happens is there's this initial rejection of both the mother and her children, which you read about in Hosea 2, verses 2 through 5.
Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise, I will strip her naked and make her as bare as on the day she was born. I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink.
So you have this kind of this picture, of what that unfaithfulness is like, and that there's going to be a total rejection.
It's really intertwining the language here between the personal relationship and then the nation's relationship with God. Because at the beginning, it really sounds like it's just between a man and a woman. Like this could be what Hosea is saying about his own wife. And then at some point, it says, I'll make her a desert, turn her into a parched land. It's like, suddenly we're talking about Israel. And then again, there in verse 5, she's talking about getting my food, my water, my wool and linen, olive oil and drink. It's like all of these products of the land.
Yeah.
God gave them the promised land and abundance. And they thought, well, let's just go, prostitute ourselves out to false gods and pray to them for all of these blessings.
Yeah. Yeah. So you see the total rejection there, that he's going to put her away and cast her away with her children. And then then you see this whole thing turn around in the middle of the chapter in verses 16 through 20. It says, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord."
Sounds a lot like Ezekiel, right? You will
Yeah.
know that I am God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, and there's lots of tie-ins to a lot of
Hmm.
the studies we've had so far. But it's interesting how, like, at the very beginning of this section, she starts to begin to love him. Like it's a you see like a page turn. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
she's going to start to call him my husband instead of my master. Like
Hmm.
there's a relationship there, a love relationship that's starting to develop in her, and it's no longer something she's doing just out of obedience to a marriage vow.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I like, verse 2. It's really reiterating, or sorry, chapter 2, reiterating chapter 1, only in more poetic language now. It's all the same things, like, marry an adulterous woman because that's what the land is, and give the children terrible names because
mhm.
I'm cursing Israel, but I'm, go back to her even when she's unfaithful, and because I'm going to redeem my people. It's just it's done with more beautiful language.
Yeah, yeah, and this whole thing of betrothal at the end, like a forever, a forever love that he's talking about
Hmm.
at the end. It's like, why are we talking about this in the context of the story of a adulterous wife that's not faithful? And it's like, it's sort of like this one of those things where you see the potential that a person has, not like the
Hmm.
person. Like when you look at somebody, if you really love them, you see what they're capable of, and you try to encourage that. And but you have to put up with the reality of where they are right now. You know,
Yeah.
um, you get down to the end, and he introduces this word that he uses 6 times in the book, which is the Hebrew word chesed, and it can mean a lot of things. It can mean like steadfast love or kindness or mercy. It's the same word you see in Lamentations 3. The steadfast love of the Lord
Mm.
never ceases,
Yeah.
and um, but here he's using it in verse 19, right where he says,
It's
"I
called
will betroth you."
unconditional love, I think, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like an unconditional love. It's like, I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. So that's that love, that word there.
Hmm.
And he's saying, I'm going to be faithful to you because I love you. And it's a love that's enduring.
Hmm.
And so um and then he says in verse 20, and you will acknowledge the Lord. And so that's the language that we'll see later on too. But that's part of that mutuality where she starts to feel the same way toward him as he feels toward her. Um, so he's making a pledge of this steadfast love, and then it's going to be forever to
Hmm.
her. So
All right. So now we're going to see kind of the restoration of the children here. All these cursed children with terrible names, right, representing the people of Israel. So this is Hosea 2, verses 21 through 23. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, and the new wine, and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. So, again, a lot of poetic language here. Look how many times it says respond. There's an interesting, we've talked before when we are talking about like wisdom or glory that's due to God, how there's like this cycle. where God feeds into us, right? Like he might give us wisdom, but then in Revelations, like we saw, we give it back to him. And with any of the blessings, right? If you if you try to turn yourself into the end or the source of any of those good things, then you're cutting off the circuit like an electrical circuit. You always have to be giving the praise back to God. And so I like that here because there's kind of this connection between he's responding to the skies and then the earth, then the grain, and then
Mm.
the fruits that come out of that. I really like that. It's basically like the water cycle.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, and an interesting thing that you wouldn't catch if you don't speak Hebrew too is that Jezreel means God plants.
Yeah.
And so
And that's where he
everything's
says, I will plant her for myself in the land.
yeah, he's redeeming every one of the names that the
Mhm.
children were given, like so that Jezreel is becoming a positive thing where God plants, and then the ones who were not loved, I'm going to show my love to them, and for the ones who are not my people, you'll be able to say that you are my people, and so every one of the three names is redeemed,
Mm-hmm.
and restored. So that's nice. And what's interesting is in each one of them is reciprocating the offer that God makes.
Right. Because they
'Cause
say, you are my God.
yeah, yeah,
That's that like conduit.
yeah,
That
yeah,
cycle.
that's good. Yeah, you picked up on that up earlier with the word respond over and over again, and then they respond at the bottom. So that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
That's good. That's a good thing. And so that's this redemption. That God's always trying to make us live up to our full potential because He loves us. And so then you get to chapter 3, and you kind of see how the object lesson of Hosea's marriage plays back into this. In Hosea 3, verses 1 through 5, it says, "The Lord said to me, 'Go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes.' So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, 'You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same toward you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return to seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days.'" So,
Yeah. Pretty, shocking stuff culturally back then in particular. But even today,
mhm.
with our kind of crumbling view of marriage and sexuality, I think still, if somebody cheats on you, most people understand, just cut them loose.
Yeah.
That's the typical response. But here, like apparently he has to buy her back. So there's some kind of, whatever it is, she sold herself or she's been made like a mistress or a courtesan or something, and he has to purchase her out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's shocking, really, to think about. And then, this whole thing, we're taking your adulterous wife back, is equivalent of the way that God loves his people.
Mhm.
Like, loving your adulterous wife is the same way God loves the Israelites.
Right.
And that is a shocking thing to contemplate too, if you think about it from your own perspective. Is God's willing to still have a relationship with you, even though you've been so unfaithful to Him.
Hmm. I mean, like going back to chapter 2 there, where we were looking at that cycle, like he's willing to keep outpouring his love and his blessing, but when they cut themselves off, they're not going to give the glory back to him. Then it's all ended.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look in verses 4 and 5 there, and you see
But they will come back to him, like it says. Yeah.
yeah, but you see there where they have to hit rock bottom first.
Mhm.
Like they had all these other gods that they worshipped, and it's like, no, you're going to go without them. Just like when Hosea told his wife, you'll have to not sleep with anybody for a while. Like, you have to clean yourself up, but I'll take you back. But you got to swear all this off.
Yeah.
And that's what's saying down here in verses 4 and 5. You got to put away all these other gods and then come back, trembling,
Mhm.
to me. So it's interesting. So this gets back to let's get back to this word chesed that we were talking about earlier. So we saw it in chapter 2, and I'm going to look at a couple other places where Hosea uses the word because it's important to his message, and it becomes important to our study later on. So in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land." And so that's that. And now he's talking to Israel. We're done with the analogy to Hosea's marriage, and there's some direct oracles to Israel. But here he's saying the same thing. He's saying where he says there's no love. That's that word chesed. That means there's no faithfulness toward God. God's faithful toward Israel, but no one's returning it in this
Mhm.
response cycle that you were talking about, and no one is acknowledging God. Like they're giving all the credit for the things God does to their other lovers,
Yeah.
their
And it
other
goes
gods.
on. It goes on to talk about here. It's accusing all the leaders. It's accusing the prophets, priests, and the leaders.
Mm,
It's that
hmm.
failure in the Shema to teach anybody anything.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, I think, in Lamentations. I'm drawing a blank now. I think it was in Lamentations where I mentioned there was a passage where it says that the Gentiles see the prophets and priests as unclean. It's like
Oh
even
yeah.
the people who don't observe God's cleanliness standards recognize how filthy you are, and it's going into that same thing here.
Well, when you mentioned the Shema, I mean, the Shema itself is like a cycle.
Hmm.
It's the next generation to
Yeah,
the next generation. Going around the circle of life kind of concept.
yeah.
To put it in a modern, Disney framework. Okay, so continuing on
Let's
with,
not do that.
well, I mean, The Lion King's kind of a cool movie, but
Yeah.
yeah. All right, so continuing with the word chesed, right in Hosea 6:4-7. "What can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears. Therefore, I cut you in pieces with my prophets. I killed you with the words of my mouth. Then my judgments go forth like the sun. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. As at Adam, they have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me there." And so this word, you see up in verse 4 where he says, "Your love is like the morning mist." That's supposed to be that steadfast love, like the unfailing love that God has for us. But
Hmm.
God's like, yours is like a morning mist that just like disappears and
As
it's
soon as the
gone.
sun comes up, it just
Yeah.
it's gone.
But then when you get down to verse 6, he says, "But what I desire is, if I desire mercy, not sacrifice." That's that same word. So that word mercy is like that steadfast love,
Hmm.
that never failing love, which is kind of a way of thinking of mercy is unfailing love that like sees past all of your imperfections and
Yeah.
sees your potential of who you really are. Loves you at your core. He says that God desires that and not sacrifice, right? An acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. He's like saying, getting it. It's like he wants our inner devotion, not our outward acts
Hmm.
of devotion, and to love like a full devotion to him, like a husband and a wife, would have for each other, where you know y- it's the depth of the relationship is what's so different about a marriage, from any other relationship you have.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like this little mini word study in Hosea of Chesed, and we'll come back to it a little bit later in our study. So before we leave the Old Testament, though, I wanted to go back and look at Jeremiah because this is a kind of a parallel passage to Hosea. We didn't talk about it when we studied Jeremiah, even though it's like one of my favorite chapters of Jeremiah. but it didn't fit into our overall thematic study that we did of Jeremiah. But this is Jeremiah 3, verses 1 through 14.
If a man divorces his wife and she leaves him and marries another man, should he return to her again? Would not the land be completely defiled? But you have lived as a prostitute with many lovers. Would you now return to me, declares the Lord? Look up to the barren heights and see. Is there any place where you have not been ravished? By the roadside you sat waiting for lovers, sat like a nomad in the desert. You have defiled the land with your prostitution and wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and no spring rains have fallen. Yet you have the brazen look of a prostitute. You refuse to blush with shame. Have you not just called to me, my father, my friend from my youth? Will you always be angry? Will your wrath continue forever? This is how you talk, but you do all the evil you can. During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not, and her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear. She also went out and committed adultery. Because Israel's immorality mattered so little to her, she defiled the land and committed adultery with stone and wood. In spite of all this, her unfaithful sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but only in pretense, declares the Lord. The Lord said to me, faithless Israel is more righteous than unfaithful Judah. Go proclaim this message toward the north. Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am faithful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. You have scattered your favors to foreign gods under every spreading tree and have not obeyed me, declares the Lord. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, and bring you to Zion.
So it's interesting because obviously Hosea would have been writing before Jeremiah. And so you wonder, did Jeremiah have Hosea?
Yeah,
Did he
to
have
draw on.
Yeah, and so but he starts off by saying how totally disgusting and defiling it would be for this to ever happen.
Yeah,
But it's the exact same scenario.
it's what they've done.
Yeah.
The most fascinating part to me is when he says that Israel has been more faithful than Judah. Because it's like Israel got destroyed first, so Judah had the warning. They saw, and then they continued in their unfaithfulness anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he says faithless Israel is more righteous than unfaithful Judah, because faithless Israel had completely left and said, you know what, I don't want to be married to you anymore. But Judah was like, oh, we got the temple, we'll act like we love God. He says they return as a pretense,
Yeah,
to
did
me.
not return to me with all their heart, but only in pretense.
Yeah. And so you get back to the same idea of I desire mercy and not sacrifices. God's like, I want your steadfast love. I want you to actually care.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to go through the motions and just say, well, I'm in a marriage, with God, and I have to do this because he's my husband,
Yeah.
And then he's saying, no, I wish that you like actually cared, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So it's a really interesting passage from Jeremiah that parallels this. Has a lot of cool aspects to it, and both stories point out that marital infidelity is such a devastating thing with really hard consequences, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And yet,
it's
even though we do the same thing, God is willing to take us back.
yeah, it's amazing, right? So that's our message from the Old Testament. Our Old Testament takeaway is that God is always faithful to us, even when we are unfaithful to Him.
That's that unconditional love.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's kind of the point of Hosea.
Yeah. So now we're going to look in the New Testament and remember, the title of our series is Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And we look at these Old Testament books and we find these main points in here. In this case, that God's always faithful to us, even when we're unfaithful to Him. And let's look in the New Testament and see where we see that concept expressed. And so every week it seems to be pretty easy to find these themes because Jesus is highly educated in the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophets, and he knows every one of these messages, and he's putting them into his own words and his own ministry.
Mhm.
So we're going to start in Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
Yeah. So one of the most famous stories in the Bible, probably.
Yeah, and it's amazing if you read it right after you read Hosea,
Yeah.
the connections that you can make in
We've
it.
done this with other Old Testament books too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the son's unfaithful to his father, right? Which is a different kind of unfaithfulness. But if you go to your dad and say, "I want my inheritance now," that's like, look, you're worth more dead than alive to me.
Yes.
So just keel
Mhm.
over, would you?
Yep. And then, not showing any appreciation to the source of all of his good things, he leaves him
Yeah.
and goes off to pursue other things, right?
Yeah.
Same as an adulterous wife. Right?
Well, he is adulterous. I mean, he's
Yeah.
with prostitutes and stuff.
That's true too. Yeah.
And then, like Hosea was predicting, he hits rock bottom
Mm-hmm.
and have this moment of clarity, like when he says that Israel will begin to yearn for God again, and
Yeah.
then he wants to come back to his father.
Yeah, so he comes back like in this trembling way that Hosea talked about. He's
Mhm.
planning out everything he's going to say because he's nervous, and he's got this big speech figured out, and he's like, I don't know what's going to happen. And then his father just comes running and embraces him,
Mhm.
welcoming him back, which is the big, surprise of the whole parable, right?
Yeah.
And
A lot of people. One of our favorite stories, just in general, for humanity, is like seeing somebody get theirs at the end of the story.
Yeah.
Like a villain, we want to see them get theirs at the end. That's like because we have this strong yearning for justice, which is good, but Jesus just flips that. So everybody's kind of like rubbing their hands. Oh, he's gonna get it now, and then he gets a hug and a feast.
yeah, I think the older son really loves those stories that end the way you said.
Yeah.
The person getting it at the end. But anyway, yeah, so he doesn't welcome his brother back. And it's really interesting to see the juxtaposition of the two sons, because what you have is the same as what you had in Hosea, where you have one son who stays and remains faithful to the father.
Judah, but it's a false.
Yeah, but he
Yeah,
doesn't really
yeah.
care. He doesn't care about his brother.
Yeah, like you said, it was a
He's
pretense.
yeah. He's just like, well, I've been doing everything you asked, but like, and why don't I get to have a part? What I really want to have is a party, but
Yeah.
and I want to have all my friends over, and I know you wouldn't like it, so I go do that when you're not around. But you know, it's just very interesting to see, how Jesus weaves all these things into this story.
Mhm.
And I think it's really kind of genius, because he's talking to a bunch of Pharisees, a bunch of men who probably wouldn't really relate to being the adulteress.
Yeah.
They would be, I know what, the adulteresses should die. That's like that we've decided. But they have to turn around and see the shoe on their foot. They're the ones, who are the being unfaithful to their father in this case. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's probably, I guess, a relationship they can relate to both sides of
yeah,
as a man. Yeah.
that's true. Yeah. So it brings up this whole point that God, he doesn't have to take us back, right? It's just like we didn't really talk about this much in Hosea, but Hosea was under no obligation to Gomer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he had
could've
every
just said,
right to
"Get outta here."
cut her loose. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Give her a certificate of divorce.
So the shocking thing about that story is not that God tells him to go marry an unfaithful woman. It's that he
Go
tells
back
him to
to
keep
her.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and bring her back.
After she commits adultery.
Because even Jeremiah in his story said that would defile the whole land if that ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so most people, they probably think that Hosea was an idiot for bringing and keeping his wife when she's going to be sleeping with other men. And most people probably think that the father in this story is foolish for welcoming the son back.
Yeah.
But when you think of it from the perspective of who we are in the story, then we should be very thankful that both of those things happen, right? That Hosea brings his wife back, that the father welcomes the son back, and that God is still willing to accept us after all the terrible things we've done.
Like, he's refusing to assert his rights. There's no rights between lovers. Like, if you're in love, you can picture a husband, going to, well, I've got a right, to make love to you. You can't. That's your duty, Or she said, I've got a right for you to, stay home this Friday night. Don't go out with your friends. Like, technically, they're right. Like, their spouse should be giving them love and affection. But like, if you actually love the person, you don't go to them with a list of demands. Hey, these are my rights. You gotta see to it that they're met. Like, there's no love. That's what's happening, and God doesn't do that either, right? There's a line. I used to listen to Lecrae, the Christian hip hop artist, in high school, but there's a line that still just bounces around in my head where he says, "If we fought for our rights, we'd be in hell tonight," which is absolutely true. Like, God is saying, yeah, I won't claim my rights. And I'm not going to give you what you deserve by right either.
Yeah, I didn't put this in the lesson, but what you said is definitely what you see all throughout the Sermon on the Mount, where you see Jesus saying, well, somewhere that it said that, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So that's a non-retaliatory ethic, or a non-escalatory ethic, rather, where Jesus, or where the Old Testament says, don't go beyond what will happen to you. Like, don't let things go out escalating out of control. But Jesus goes to the non-retaliatory ethic and says, but I say, turn the other cheek when somebody slaps you in the face.
Yeah.
And now, like, he's taking it to a new level. Like, yeah, you're well within your rights to go poke that other guy's eye out, but what if you just didn't?
Yeah.
So, interesting.
All right. So, looking at Matthew 9 here, this is the calling of the Apostle Matthew. This is chapter 9, verse 9 through 13. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And this reminds me, I quoted this at some point. I cannot remember which episode it was, and I didn't want to go back and watch 30 hours of us talking to find it. I know I quoted it at one point, though, where um, someone has said, I think it's Augustine, that whoever is the man who is lost in his passions is less lost than the man who has lost his passion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's like exactly the whole point here, right? Like we're talking about that love, right? Like God wants the people to want him, even if they're just not doing a good job of it at all. And that's what Jesus is saying. Like it doesn't do me any good that you're over here. You think you're healthy, like you're going through all the motions, and you don't think you need me. The people who know that, like how messed up they are, they're in a better position to receive me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's who I'm ministering to.
Yeah. Yeah. And he quotes Hosea 6:6, and so he goes back to that, I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Yes.
And then that hesed love that we were talking about earlier.
Like the people who are lost in their passions, they love something, right? They've got passion for something. But the people who have built this self-righteous legalist doctrine, they've like suppressed all of that. They don't love anything,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
including God.
So, and he calls, he not come to call the righteous, right, but the sinners. And he came for the adulterous wife who now loves him.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's not coming for the faithful wife who doesn't love him, like, but just goes through the motions. It's kind of weird. It's
like we were talking about, like I was talking about with the rights. Like the Pharisees are thinking that way. Look, we keep the law. We got extra laws to make sure we don't even tiptoe close to the law. We do all the sacrifices. I'm doing everything right. So God, you gotta respect me for that. It's like I want my rights.
Yeah, and
that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, it's like and when the Bible talks about how it's a double-edged sword, I mean, if you take that approach, well, I mean, what about all the verses that cut the other way?
Yeah, and so like you're saying, who wants a spouse who will do all the right things with no love, like a robot? You could make a perfect robot spouse that would do anything you want, but they don't love you. Like you would not, in the end, you would not want that.
No. Nope. Well, so it's interesting because Jesus tells him, go and learn what this means. I think that's really funny because, like, here they are, like all the teachers of the law, and he's like, I'll just quote part of the Old Testament and tell you, hey, go learn this. That's pretty insulting to them, I think. Yeah. But it's necessary because they don't understand it. So then you get to Matthew 12, and you have this interesting exchange in Matthew 12, 1-8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. He answered, haven't you read what David did when his companions were hungry? He and his companions were hungry. He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah, such a powerful statement there. Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. That's not one that they can let stand.
Yeah, I like his, if Jesus tells you to go learn something, you probably ought to go learn it.
Yeah, and Matthew records this twice here, so it might have been something he was in the habit of saying and really made an impression on Matthew.
Yeah. Well, the first time he tells him to go and learn, and this one he says, well, if you had gone and done what I told you. So it's kind of like...
That's true. It's 3 chapters later.
Yeah, he's drilling them hard.
Maybe it's like a lot of the same guys. It's like, hey, do you remember the other day?
Well, and plus, what is it that's greater here that's going on? He says something greater than the temple is here. And, they're going out and spreading Jesus' message that God welcomes the prodigal son back, the lost son back. Mm-hmm. And they're spreading this message that God's the one who would bring the adulterous wife back. And so um, he's saying that that's a greater ministry than anything that's going
Yeah.
on with your sacrifices and things that you're doing at the temple.
Yeah. Well, this creates kind
'Cause-
of a, I mentioned earlier, like we like the story where somebody gets their just desserts because we have a yearning for justice, and we're supposed to have that yearning for justice, right? But we're also supposed to have a yearning for mercy, and that's what the Pharisees lack. So the Pharisees don't, they're not understanding like, God gave us the law, like that was for a reason. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a joke. You know,
Mhm.
God's righteous, so they do have, well, at least one thing right, which is like we are supposed to understand God's righteousness. So how do you combine these two ideas that God is perfectly just and perfectly merciful? How do you uphold His righteousness and the fact that we're unrighteous, but He still wants to be with us? And our next passage, I think, kind of gives us the answer here. So this is from Romans 3, verses 21 through 26. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known. Because before this, Paul's been making the point that through the law we can know God. We have knowledge of righteousness and knowledge of our own sin. Uh, so, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of His blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate His righteousness, because in His forbearance He had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate His righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So that's the answer there to what the Pharisees are not getting, right? As it says in verse 25, He did this to demonstrate His righteousness. And because he had left prior sins unpunished. So He does have that sense of justice, right? But he's showing mercy. And so to uphold His own justice, right, and His own righteousness, he gives His own blood as payment. And that's how He can become, which we've talked about this before, back in Leviticus, He's the one who's just and the one who justifies.
hmm hmm Well, if you think about God's righteousness, it doesn't come from a law. Like God doesn't become
Yeah.
righteous by following a bunch of
It's the
laws.
other way around.
Yes,
Yeah.
the other way around. And then the law. That's why the law and the prophets testify to God's righteousness
Mhm.
because um, this righteousness is being made known through Christ. You know, it's just like that. It's just like the law. It's just like the prophets. What did the prophets? What were they really calling us back to? Like we talked about them being covenant enforcers, right? Well, they're not calling us back to the laws particularly. They're calling us back to the covenant faithfulness
Yeah.
that
Keep
embodies that. It embodies keeping the law, but it's more of the relational side of it.
Yeah, if you go back and look at all that, like the first few episodes we did there in the Torah, the early books of the Bible, we talked a lot about covenant. And I kept driving the point home. This isn't like a new covenant that's canceling out the old one. We have a covenant between God and His people at all times, right? Like with Adam and with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, and now through Christ. It's the same relationship, the same covenant. It's closer to like amendments, to the Constitution. It's like the same thing, the same relationship, same purpose. And so the Mosaic law hadn't even been given like in the time of Abraham, for example, right? So what was Abraham just like? Oh, I don't know if God's really righteous because I don't have the law. The relationship's already there. God's righteousness is shown in myriad ways, and the law was one of the ways. So it's a part of our covenant relationship. We can't just ignore the Mosaic law because it's still teaching us something, right? You still can't, go out and commit adultery. But if you have, then Jesus here is showing His willingness to accept you anyway.
Yeah, it's a very interesting passage. I mean, obviously a very famous passage, but God's faithful even to the unfaithful, right?
Mhm.
And that's what Hosea was saying.
Well, that's fortunate because that's all of us.
Yeah, well, that's what this passage says, right? In verse 23, that all have sinned. But so God's righteous and faithful, even to the unfaithful. But then we have the opportunity then to reciprocate in this cyclical, system you were talking about, where God provides us, offers His faithfulness, we offer it back to Him, and um, and so He loves all people, He dies for all people, and then that allows all people to be able to return His love and be saved. Okay, now not everybody chooses to do that, right? But that doesn't
Yeah.
make God any less justified or less the justifier. But
Right.
the
Well,
fact
it's
that
going back to that cycle, right?
yeah,
Like he's pouring out his grace,
hmm
and you may not choose to give praise back to him, to give glory, wisdom, honor, power, and all those things to him. And he's like, fine, you're cutting yourself off from that, so it's
yeah.
going to stop flowing.
So, but another thing that justifies God for doing this, which many people object to, like Caleb talked about, a lot of people want to see the people get their comeuppance,
Hmm.
but He doesn't. He says, no, I'm going to give you mercy instead, and anybody can accept it. Well, the fact that some people do accept it also justifies God and His righteousness,
Yeah.
because He extends what's necessary for those who will accept it to be saved. And some choose to reciprocate, and that justifies God for having done that because He saved some.
Right. That's why he wants to be the one who's just and justifies those who have faith. Right. That
Mhm.
it's where does he say it in verse 22? The righteous is given in faith to all who believe.
Mhm. Mhm.
Or in 25, it's he presents Christ as an atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith, because it's a relationship that we're part of it,
Yeah.
and part of, like you're saying, part of what justifies that action is the response of his people that he calls.
Yeah. 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 It's great. And it's so similar to Hosea. Now, we're going to end in Revelation. We always try to get to Revelation when we can. And there's a really good section in chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. This is the letter to the church in Ephesus. It says, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practice of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." So, one of the kind of key in on this part where he says you've lost that love you had at first,
Yeah.
and
Do the things you did at first.
yeah. Well, he
Yeah.
tells them though they're still doing lots of good things. Oh, you guys do all kinds of good things I could commend you for.
You hate evil that I hate, which
Yeah.
is good.
Yeah, but then again, he's like, but what about our relationship? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I like obedience; it's great and everything, but it's like not the same as love,
Mhm.
right? And so he wants their love; he doesn't want their legalism. And so because faithfulness comes from love and not legalism, right? He's calling them back to love.
Yeah.
He'd rather have faithfulness than this blind obedience. That
Remember, Christ does say, "If you love me, keep my commands." Right?
Mhm,
He doesn't say
mhm.
the reverse. If you keep my commands, therefore you love me. Like,
Yeah, right.
it
Well,
doesn't.
yeah.
That it's not. It is not mutually exclusive. You can have one without the other.
And he doesn't say keep my commands and then I'll love you
Yeah.
either. He's like, yeah. So it's like this whole concept of like a loveless marriage that we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
And I mean, a loveless marriage covenant is basically a piece of paper, right? In our modern context, there's a marriage license on file down at the courthouse that proves that
Yeah.
we're in love.
It's like if
oh,
you've seen The Office, and Dwight asks Angela, like, do you love me? She goes, "I've already admitted that I do. Why do you keep making me repeat it?" Oh, that's comforting.
yeah, I mean, if you have to appeal to your marriage license, or if you have to appeal to your vows that you made however many years ago to prove that you love somebody, right? Then it may be a loveless marriage there. I mean, if you say, "Hey, I signed a marriage license, right? I kept all my vows." I mean, didn't I? And it's like, yeah, but do you love me is the question, right? And so if we don't love God, then we're not in a faithful covenant with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Jesus was saying. And when he said, go learn what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Are you asking me all of these questions out of love for man, your fellow man, and also for God? Or are you asking me all these questions because you're trying to get somebody? God, gotcha.
Yeah.
You know?
So the good news is that we are still God's first love, and he's always going to be faithful to us. And he stands with open arms, ready to welcome us back when we return to him.
Yeah, yeah. And that leads to our New Testament takeaway, which is that the faithful love of Jesus Christ embraces us in our brokenness and restores our faith in God. And so I think, and we wanted to say it that way because we have this broken relationship with God, and we feel like the unfaithful wife, the adulterous wife, the filthy, sinful person that could never be welcomed back, the prodigal son who has done unspeakable things and abused his dad to his face, and now he has to go back to him for his salvation. And the point is that that's not the way we should feel. We should feel like that faithful love of God is always there, and that we could always go back to him. He would always embrace us even in our brokenness, and he would always restore our faith in God. Because I think, like the story of the prodigal son, I think when people hear that, it restores their faith in God. I think they say, oh, I thought God was going to smash him, when he came back, but he didn't. And they go, oh, I like that.
Right. Yeah. We struggled with the way to word that because we didn't want to just dismiss the law, right? Like if you look at that Revelations passage where he says, you hate the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Like, so you hate evil. That's good. You are supposed to, the law is good, and you are supposed to try to uphold it and recognize the righteousness of that, right? But you don't love that. You don't love the command or the legalism. You don't fall in love with the hatred of evil, right? It's not enough to just hate evil. You also have to love God. And the law is supposed to point us towards that, towards his goodness.
Yeah, and he loves you. Like one of our slogans is renew your faith in faith. Because faith is a good thing, and our faith is what imputes our righteousness to us.
Yeah.
As we talked about in the Romans 3 passage, and it's not a negative thing. We aren't the people of no, you can't do that. No, like the Pharisees wanted to be. And Jesus is like, why can't we be the people of yes? Why can't we be the people, like he talks about in John chapter 10, who have life and have it to the full? And that's what we've been trying to, teach through our lessons. So God wants you back, and Jesus came to love and embrace us for the Father, and he's asking us to return his love.
That's right.
So he's Caleb, and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica, Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.